Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webcast. We're glad you're joining us here for Culturally Sensitive Teaching in STEM. I'm your host behind the scenes, Jennifer Wicks from Learning and Development. Always a pleasure to work with the STEMnet team from the Chancellor's Office. And we want to let you know, I'll share a link with you in just a moment. We will have live captions streaming for you, and those will be available in just a few moments. Would love to know what campus you're joining from today or organization. If you're not at the CSU, please do put that answer in the pod at the lower portion of the screen. Excellent. It's going to be a very engaging and interesting session today. We will have Q&A with each presenter after their presentation and some closing comments at the very end. And we're very happy that you're here today for this incredibly important topic today. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our Executive Director of STEMnet at the Office of the Chancellor, Dr. Frank A. Gomez. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Gomez, to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the kind introduction, and welcome all of you. I hope you and all your families are all healthy and safe. I would be doing a disservice if I did not say how much I've been looking forward to today's webcast on culturally sensitive teaching in STEM. This topic is so apropos for the time we live in, and so resonates with the mission of the CSU. The growing popularity of culturally responsive instruction has caused traditional trends in education to be rethought and reversed, with the onus to adapt to the demands of the multicultural classroom being increasingly placed on the instructor. Given the wealth of diversity in our nation's schools, it is no wonder that instructional theory is advocating a shift toward a pedagogy that emphasizes a comfortable and academically enriching environment for students of all the ethnicities, races, beliefs, and creeds. While culturally responsive teaching is gaining popularity, what this approach actually means often depends on who you ask. Researchers have raised questions that, without the proper guidance, education leaders and individual educators can adopt simplistic views of what it means to teach in culturally responsive ways. Moving forward, therefore, requires that educators and those who support their efforts have a coherent understanding of what culturally responsive teaching does and does not entail. Fortunately, the seminal work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, Geneva Gay, and Dango Paris has provided us a solid foundation and starting point with which to learn from. Whatever term is used, culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, or culturally sustaining pedagogy, what rings true is students' unique cultural strengths need to be identified and nurtured to promote their achievement and sense of well-being about their cultural place in the world. Their cultural capital has too long been undervalued and not given its place in society. Today's speakers are proven leaders in culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy, and it is a pleasure to have them all here today. Before we begin, I want to remind the audience to use the open chat box on the screens to type in their questions. Our speakers, when not presenting, will make every effort to respond in real time. So let's begin. It's my pleasure to introduce Heather Macias from the Department of Teacher Education at Cal State Long Beach, who will be presenting culturally responsive teaching, serving the needs and integrating the strengths of historically marginalized STEM students. Heather, take it away.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you all for coming today. Today I'll be talking about my experiences teaching a literacy course that's embedded in culturally responsive pedagogy, or I'll be referring to it as CRP, for pre-service STEM teacher candidates who are pursuing teacher credentials in health, math, various sciences, and also physical education. So to summarize briefly, historically marginalized students have not been as academically successful as their white counterparts in U.S. schools. The lack of inclusion, equity, and diversity in traditional K-12 public school curriculum and our classrooms has led to this opportunity gap or equity gap that continues to persist as long as schools do not approach teaching from a perspective that values the knowledge and the communities that all our students come from. So in terms of STEM teaching, the Eurocentric history and tradition of science education has, unfortunately, historically been whitewashed, prioritizing the knowledge, perspectives, and contributions of basically white men, which fails to acknowledge the dynamic tension and complexities of culture and indigenous knowledge. So as a result, many underrepresented STEM students never get to see themselves represented in the curriculum, in their classrooms, or even in their major departments should they pursue a higher education STEM degree. This is not acceptable for our Black, Indigenous, and other students of color. So one solution at the classroom level is to teach STEM topics in a way that increases the use of race and culturally responsive pedagogy to positively impact students' understandings of who does STEM work, that they can pursue a STEM career, and that therefore they can contribute to diversifying the field of STEM. So preparing culturally responsive STEM teachers who understand the role of culture in teaching and learning is essential in pursuing these goals. Culturally responsive pedagogy, CRP, it appeals to all students, but it is more than just this idea of good teaching. CRP STEM education has a critical focus on the process of teaching and learning of STEM topics, especially when compared to traditional STEM instruction that really just kind of prioritizes and focuses more just on content. So rather, CRP STEM education takes a more critical stance towards teaching STEM topics. It takes a more critical stance about constructing scientific knowledge, and it uses this knowledge in ways that empower both students and teachers to learn and to extend their learning beyond the classroom in ways that are relevant to the lived realities and the cultural histories of the students in the classroom at the time. So equitable teaching in STEM courses provides opportunities for students to build and to embody STEM identities, as well as their capacity to do science in school and beyond school. So I teach pre-service teachers, but the work that we do on cultural responsivity is the same type of work that can and needs to be translated into higher ed STEM courses. So in my teacher education courses, STEM engage in a variety of topics and strategies to explore the roles that literacy and culture play in students' learning. So we begin the semester exploring different ways that students' intersectional and complex identities impact their learning, including exploring the cultures and the communities to which students belong through various scenario work and in discussing ways to create inclusive classroom spaces where students feel safe and supported as learners in STEM classrooms. Regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their home language, they feel included and welcomed into a STEM classroom. We also spend several weeks learning how to link students' home experiences to their STEM curriculum. So this includes learning to embed real-world problems into students' learning, and even using culturally relevant analogies to help students understand and contextualize their STEM content. So during this time, we learn about and we practice accessing and integrating students' funds of knowledge into their classroom as tools for learning. So briefly, when I talk about funds of knowledge, that means using students' cultural and historical knowledge and skills that the students develop within their communities and within their homes with their families as tools for learning, but also for teaching others, including teaching the teacher sometimes. So to help my candidates understand what constitutes a funds of knowledge, we prepare funds of knowledge presentations for one another to learn about not only what funds of knowledge are, but also the variety of funds of knowledge that students, including themselves, the teachers, candidates themselves, bring into the classroom, and likewise how to reframe deficit perceptions of historically marginalized students to really value all the types of funds of knowledge that students may have. So some examples of funds of knowledge that my pre-service candidates have presented on include, cooking tamales, being a feminist pop culture expert, being a board game aficionado, and working in customer service since they graduated from high school, all of which my credential candidates have been able to talk about the skills and the knowledge that they have derived from these life experiences and from these long-term involvements in which they have shaped, who they are as learners and also who they are as teachers. So they've learned things like, patience and perseverance, to learning to become flexible communicators with one another, and learning to advocate for others. I've also had students present funds of knowledge that people may see as, a disadvantage or as a challenge that they have to overcome in their lives. But then through my students' presentations, they've reframed these life experiences to become strengths that they can use in the classroom. From students who were born with childhood diabetes to trans students who then become LGBTQ+ advocates. So by learning about the value of students' funds of knowledge as tools to teach and learn from one another, my teacher candidates are encouraged to understand how creating opportunities for meaningful interactions can help students learn from one another and to co-construct knowledge using one another's skills and knowledge that they bring with them into the classroom. My pre-service candidates also develop cross-curricular units with teachers in other content areas to create links between STEM learning and then other content areas, whether they're STEM content areas or even humanities. So we explore this idea of linked learning and how authentic learning contexts in various career paths and industry sectors can help students learn and demonstrate their content knowledge in ways that are authentic to the discipline and that connect their STEM learning to community issues, community engagement, and community activism. So for example, I've had students create project-based learning assessments centering around community activism and engagement, creating a project for students to plan with their local indigenous tribe, the Tongva people, to share their ideas and history on land cultivation, land loss, environmental preservation, and also land acknowledgements. I've had students also create projects integrating math, science, PE, and health that had students research diseases that affect their local communities to create health fairs for local families and community members about disease prevention and disease treatment. Students have also created STEM based cross-curricular projects for earthquake preparedness, revitalizing local hiking trails, COVID-19 health activism and awareness, and even creating sustainable school gardens to address food deserts in local neighborhoods. So all these projects give my credential candidates the opportunity to see how they can make their teaching more relevant, more engaging, and meaningful to their future students in ways that connect students' learning to community issues, community needs, and community voices. And then lastly, pre-service teachers, they learn a variety of literacy and culturally responsive teaching strategies to promote equitable and inclusive teaching, including using small group work that has group roles that play up to students' strengths, reciprocal learning strategies, open-ended problems to encourage discussion and also criticality in terms of what they're learning versus what they're not learning, offering student choice to create meaning for the students, and accessing students' prior knowledge to connect to their new knowledge. So overall, pre-service teachers learn about the importance of giving students agency in their learning and learning from others to create this classroom community of learners who really support one another in their future STEM classrooms. So consistent with past research, STEM credential candidates demonstrate student-centered teaching practices and beliefs, and by the end of the course, they're really able to adopt a learning-centered perspective on a learning-centered perspective, meaning that they can understand the importance of getting to know your students' cultures, getting to know your students' local communities, and understanding the complex identities that our students have to find relevant STEM topics or strategies to support student learning and to affirm our students' lived experiences. Credential candidates are also able to understand how to create caring, learning classroom communities that engage students in STEM topics through curiosity, through inquiry, such as using project-based learning and link learning that relates content to career-based learning for different career paths in STEM. They understand the importance of supporting academic discourse that is also culturally congruent, and they've had many opportunities to discuss different ways to integrate content into community issues and activism in ways that foster sociocultural awareness and promote student empowerment and criticality in school and beyond. Credential and candidates learn to understand that culturally responsive STEM teaching is the integration of content, pedagogy, and the knowledge of students into one cohesive framework, where content refers to their science content and their standards-based teaching, pedagogy refers to the teaching methods and strategies, and knowledge of students constitutes the instructor's understanding of students' cultural backgrounds as well as their learning styles and abilities. So by understanding the purposes of CRP, pre-service teachers move beyond just focusing on, trying to replicate CRP practices and instead begin to understand that the next step in being a truly culturally responsive educator is using these culturally responsive practices for student empowerment and success. STEM pre-service teachers move away from this deficit perspective of culturally and linguistically diverse students, learning to really value the cultural and linguistic skills and knowledge that students bring into the classroom, and how that knowledge and skill sets that students have can be used as tools for learning and for teaching others, including the teacher. So credential candidates, they're helping to do away with that equity gap that perpetuates a deficit or lacking perception of historically marginalized students, and instead they embody additive perspectives that value all students' identities and cultures in the classroom. So currently I plan on continuing my work in STEM education, including my teacher education courses. I'm working to more deliberately integrate social justice and anti-racist teaching into my STEM courses at the secondary level. And then my research continues to look at CRP and the role it plays in higher ed STEM courses, including participating in a grant entitled Rebalancing the Equity Gap in Chemistry Education with Individualized Adaptive Learning that's being done through UC Davis, Cal State San Bernardino, Mendocino College, Academic Center of California Community Colleges, and of course the CSU Chancellor Office. And I have similar work that I'm pursuing related to STEM and CRP with the team from CSUN and LA Community Colleges, in which we're hoping to integrate CRP into a life science courses, and then also a few other STEM-related courses at other institutions that I'm working on. And so in summary, if you're going to take anything away from my talk today, I'd like you just to consider the importance that CRP has in students learning from K through 12 to higher ed. Culturally responsive teaching makes learning more appropriate and effective by teaching to and through the strengths of diverse students, really embodying an additive perspective of learning for all students that's engaging, authentic, and relevant to their lived realities. And so to sum up, I'd like to end my presentation with a quote from prominent CRP scholar Zaretta Hammond, where she says that culture responsive teaching is less about just using racial pride as a motivator and more about mimicking students' cultural learning styles and tools, strategies their moms, dads, grandmas, and other community folks use to teach them life skills and basic concepts long before they come to school and during out-of-school time. So thank you, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Heather. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. I've certainly learned a lot. Question here. What are some challenges you have encountered with secondary STEM teachers in helping them to understand how to effectively implement CRP into the classroom?
Yeah, great question. So my STEM credential candidates usually come in kind of not understanding how CRP, let alone things like literacy, are relevant to their content area. So before I can even delve into what CRP is, what it looks like in the classroom, I have to spend the first few weeks just kind of showing them the ways that culture and identity really affect a student's ability to learn. And so that creates this buy-in where they're like, wow, I do need to take into account who my students are, where they come from, the cultures that they bring in with them, so they can feel included and safe in this classroom. So I do that by having us unpack different student scenarios that may happen in their STEM courses, where students might feel unengaged or disconnected, excluded, maybe even fearful, all of which prevent students from learning. And so we do a lot of also talking about our own learning and school experiences with education and what worked for us in our classrooms versus what didn't work for us as learners, and connecting those experiences to these new theories and strategies that we're learning about that are related to CRP and also literacy that can make students' learning more authentic and relevant to them. So once I've convinced them that, you can't divorce culture and identity from classroom learning, then it becomes, showing them how to integrate culturally aware, equitable teaching and learning into their classrooms through different strategies, through different approaches, different teaching frameworks that all support, all types of learning and all types of students. So the educational opportunity gap, it won't close if my pre-service teachers don't know how to teach all their students. And so that's really my goal for them to understand too, is their role in helping to close that opportunity or equity gap.
Thank you, Heather. The students should they're very fortunate to have you as their professor in the class. So once again, thank you, and wonderful presentation. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So our next speaker is Aletha Harven from Stanislaus State, and she'll be speaking on culturally responsive teaching in STEM, transformative tools for student engagement. Aletha, your turn.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gomez. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. As Dr. Gomez said, I'm Dr. Aletha Marie Harven, and I'll be speaking about transformative tools for student engagement. I am an associate professor at Stanislaus State University in the Department of Psychology and Child Development. I'm also a co-principal investigator for the program Ciencia, which I love, and that's housed within my College of Science and is funded by the National Science Foundation. And we focus on culturally responsive teaching, so this is amazing. I'm so happy that I was invited to be a part of this webcast. Also, I have a webinar series titled Transformative Conversations, Promoting Equity and Inclusion in Education and Beyond. And I know some of the people who told me they were going to be in the audience today have attended some of my sessions. And if you want to learn more about any of what I'm doing here, you can go ahead and send me an email. My email's on this slide. Okay. So I titled this particular slide Culturally Relevant Education because culturally responsive teaching falls under this larger umbrella of providing students with a culturally relevant education. And so when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, we have to focus on the work of Dr. Geneva Gay. She is the person, she is the scholar behind culturally responsive teaching, where she focused on the practice of teaching, right? That's what culturally responsive teaching is really about. And Gloria Latson-Billings, Dr. Latson-Billings, she's the amazing scholar behind culturally relevant pedagogy, right? And here she has focused on teacher posture and paradigm, right? So when we think about pedagogy, that has to do with everything we're doing in the classroom in terms of how we're delivering our curriculum, how we are interacting with our students, our tone of voice, the way we present ourselves in the classroom, right? So pedagogy, I just love studying it. So anyways, I wanted to read these quotes. So Dr. Geneva Gay, she said, while caring about conveys feelings of concern for one's state of being, caring for, right, caring for our students is active engagement and doing something to positively affect it. And with Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings, she said, good teachers create a net designed to catch all students. So, you know, we need to work really hard to make sure all of our students are successful, right? They feel affirmed in their identities. They feel good about who they are. That's part of our job as educators. And I wanted to make sure I put their pictures on this slide because everyone, as you know, is Women's History Month. Let's celebrate women. And these are two amazing women, and they are Black women. And it's really important, I think, to understand the origins of this work, okay? The work of culturally relevant education. So these are our leaders. And there are of course, other scholars as well who contribute and have been contributing for a long time to culturally relevant education, but let's celebrate women. Okay, so with culturally relevant education, I have so many tools in my toolbox for all of you, but I just thought I would point out some information and provide you with some tools, tell you about some of the techniques I'm utilizing, but I have recommendations for you, okay? So number one, I really think it's important for you to deepen your knowledge on culturally relevant education. You have to keep in mind there are lots of theories related to cultural competency, including the literature on multicultural education, and you have to engage in the readings, right? You have to grapple with that information. You have to keep attending seminars and workshops so that you can increase your own cultural competency and you can utilize that information in the classroom. So with all of these theories that are related to culturally relevant education, you know, it's really about affirming students' identities, and we have to keep in mind that students are walking into our classrooms with intersecting social identities, so that's something to, you know, acknowledge. Also, we need to affirm students' social and cultural histories. We need to use their lived experiences in the classroom to increase their interest and engagement. We need to build students' academic and socio-emotional skills. So maintaining high academic standards is really important as you're engaging in culturally responsive, culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogies. And we also need to help students to recognize, analyze, and confront social inequities. Something that I do is at the beginning of every semester, I give my students a survey. And on that survey, I pose lots of questions, and I'm just trying to get to know my students. And I use that information from the surveys in order to inform my curricular practices. I might modify my curricular activities. So that's something that I really enjoy doing. Something else I do that you might want to do is I work one-on-one with my students. So I have one-on-one meetings with them, actually. And I know some of you might be thinking, well, what if I have a class of 100 students or, 200 students? And I totally get it. There's ways we can maybe work around that. But something I like to do is have one-on-one meetings. Like I had a one-on-one meeting with a student just yesterday, and we had a 30-minute conversation, and it was amazing. And it's just a really great way to connect with students, and it helps them to feel valued. And I get to learn what my students are looking for out of their education here at Stan State. Okay, so number 2, I want you to deepen your knowledge on students from historically underserved communities. Okay, so read the literature. There's lots of literature regarding students from underserved communities. And when you're reading this literature, you do want to stay away from developing stereotypes about different groups of students, okay? Because there's always going to be variations within any cultural group. So we want to stay away from stereotypes, but we do want to have some general knowledge on different groups of students. Also, we want to reject deficit thinking, right? And that's where you might, believe that certain groups of students are lacking in particular areas. You have these preconceived notions about the deficits you believe that they have. And so when you are looking at students out of that lens, for instance, if you think that all Black students are going to have a very difficult time learning in your classroom because we don't typically see a lot of Black people in STEM. Well, first of all, there are a lot of Black people who go into STEM if you just look at historically Black colleges and universities, okay? But I know, especially out here on the West Coast, where we are, we have a lot of we may not be seeing a lot of Black students, right, in the STEM fields. And so what does that really mean? It doesn't mean that these students aren't smart or they're not going to walk into your classroom wanting to learn. It just means maybe you need to do something to make them feel a sense of belonging, right? And so that's my next point, increase students' sense of belonging. So if you look at the first author that I have here in the citation, Strayhorn, Dr. Strayhorn, I actually had him on my webinar series. He just presented last week, and so maybe some of you came and listened to him, but he was talking about sense of belonging, and he's a leading scholar when it comes to sense of belonging. And so what do we do to make sure that our students feel a sense of belonging? So this particular citation, if you look at the article, it talks about Black and Latino males in STEM. And so when these young men were interviewed, they were saying they just didn't feel that they belonged. And so that led them to switch majors. So we need to keep that in mind. Okay, I'm running out of time. Number 3, shift your paradigm of education and share power with students. So move from being teacher-centered to learner-centered. So I have some notes. Just that I want to go over with you. So with teacher-centered learning, that's where the focus is all on you. And you are making all the choices, all the decisions. With learner-centered classrooms, you are sharing power with students. The classroom is active. The classroom is busy. Students feel that they have choices, right? And so we want to move from our classes being teacher-centered to being learner-centered. So sharing power with students. Let me give you an example. In one of my classes, I'll call the class out, it's Psychology of Adjustment. In that class at the beginning of the semester, I tell students, okay, this is what the class is about. We go over it. I say, these are the topics I want to go over with you, but I want to know what you want to get out of this class. Tell me what questions you have. What do you want to know? And so the students write down their topics, they write down their questions. I take that information and guess what I do with it? I come up with themes. I then go and I change my curriculum around. Okay, I know that sounds scary, but I change my curriculum around. I present it to the students and say, do you like these topics? Do you like what we're going to be talking about? This addresses your needs, what you're interested in learning. It addresses my needs too, and what I would like you to learn in this class. And so the students look over it, we talk about it, they say, yeah, I like this is good. What did I do? So what I'm doing in that class is I am making sure my students feel empowered. I'm getting their buy-in, right, into the curriculum. I'm getting them excited about what they're going to learn. I'm increasing their motivation. And guess what? Students are very successful in that particular class. I work hard in all my other classes to make sure students are successful, but that's just one example where I'm sharing power with students. I'm not just walking and saying, this is what you're going to learn. I'm like, what do you want to learn in all of this? I want to help you. Okay, everyone, 2 minutes. Number 4, reflection and action. This is where you have to be fully present when you are in the classroom. And so what do I mean by that? If you're lecturing and you notice students dozing off, putting their heads down, starting to talk to other students, they're on their phone, right? They love to be on their phone. Okay. Are you going to keep lecturing? Are you going to stop and say, you know what, I need to adjust what's happening in the moment. So let me put the students in groups. Let me give them a couple of questions to answer. Let me create a quick project in my head and tell them, hey, you're going to do this right now. That's being present. And this has to do with reflection and action. You have to pay attention fully to what is going on in that classroom. So note-taking is important. Constantly take notes so you can reflect as an educator. Requesting feedback from students. During class time, you can get feedback from them so you know how you're doing. Checkpoints, so having checkpoints set up. And adjusting your practice in the moment. Totally important. Okay, next slide. All right, so troubleshooting. What's some troubleshooting here? Some of the challenges you might experience when trying to provide your students with a culturally relevant education is a lack of pedagogical training, right? If you're not familiar with all of these pedagogical styles, it might seem really overwhelming. So it's really important, my suggestion for you is to engage in individual learning. So like I said, continue to read, come to webinars, go to seminars, talk to different people on your campus who are doing this great work, and then that will help you out. And also collaborative learning. And this is really important when it comes to my grant program, Ciencia. We are all about collaborative learning. We work with my leadership team that I'm a part of. We work with our colleagues in the College of Science to talk about and examine our curricular practices. We share practices. It's a really fun program. I love it. Number 2, structural issues, right? So some of you might be experiencing these issues such as class size, the length of your class. Maybe you don't feel your classes are long enough to engage in a lot of these different strategies or using them. Curricular content, I'll hear faculty say, well, there's a certain amount of curriculum, like I have to get through. There's just a certain amount of material I have to get through. So I may not be able to really focus on the pedagogy of teaching. I need to lecture, right? So these are issues. So what are some suggestions that I have? Encourage departmental conversations and action surrounding these issues. That's really important for your department chair and your colleagues to really consider these issues. So maybe it's about class sequencing, right? Maybe it's about curricular collaboration, so doing what we do in Ciencia. And then also it's important to encourage a culture of self-directed learning amongst your students. So really looking into that literature and helping your students to be self-guided learners. And then the last challenge might be faculty workload, right? Some of us are teaching lots and lots of classes. And so it's really important to adopt some strategies for balancing teaching, research, and service. Okay, and my time is up, everyone, but I just wanted to leave you with some books that might be of interest to you. Social Justice Instruction, for those of you who buy this book, look at the very first chapter. I have a couple of chapters that I contributed to this book, but the very first chapter is a chapter that I wrote with a really good colleague on campus, and we literally outline what a safe classroom looks like, how you develop a safe and inclusive classroom. We're very specific, so you should read chapter 1 for sure and all the other chapters. The Handbook on Promoting Social Justice in Education. amazing. It will come in 3 volumes. I was asked to be on the editorial board. There's a lot of really good chapters here. And then I just wrote a book, or not a book, I just wrote a chapter for this book that's going to be published in April. Developmentally appropriate curriculum and instruction. And in my chapter, I really pose a lot of questions for teachers, for educators to use in reflecting on their pedagogical practices. Thank you so much, everyone. That's it for my presentation.
Thank you, Aletha, for a very, very insightful presentation. Briefly, we have a question here. How do we balance upholding standards and adequately preparing students for future classes and careers with recognizing the background and life circumstances of our students and structuring our courses to support them?
You know what? Yes, that's a great question. You know, part of cultural or culturally responsive teaching and just culturally relevant education is, like I was saying before, maintaining your high standards. You have to maintain high standards. So when we are considering students' diverse cultural backgrounds, when we're focusing, you know, on how to really help our students from underserved communities, we can't engage in deficit thinking. We have to say, you know what? For my students who are from underserved communities who may not have a lot of opportunities, I need to be the one pushing them to be their best. I need to be the one using their cultural knowledge, their funds of knowledge, as the first speaker said, to really help the students to meet these high expectations and standards that I have. So I know for me, I never lower my standards. My standards have always remained high. I'm just more flexible in helping the students to meet those standards. So to me, culturally relevant education is about being flexible, giving students choices, because when students feel good about your classroom, when they feel connected to you as an educator, when they feel valued, when they feel seen and heard, that's going to help motivate them, and they're going to want to perform well in your classroom. So if you want students to meet these high standards, make them feel good, make them feel valued, give them the tools they need to succeed. That's what you do.
Great. Thank you, Aletha, and thank you for presenting today.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Melissa Navarro Martell from San Diego State, and her presentation is entitled Ideological Perspectives in STEM with Latinx Students at HSIs. Melissa, it's all yours.
Good morning, buenos dias, greetings from Kumeyaay land. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into this. And I'm going to start off with my positionality because we always bring our biases into what we do and the work that we do with our students. So I want you to know that I am an immigrant. I came to the U.S. when I was 10 years old, and I actually moved to San Diego. And in Tijuana, prior to coming to the U.S., I was known for my math. I was the math person in the city, and I was competing academically as a first, second, third, fourth, fifth grader. And so it wasn't until I migrated to the U.S. that my identity, this person that did really well in mathematics, to being an English learner, which is a deficit label that I dislike as a former child student, and now as an academic scholar, I tend to use the word multilingual learner. So I invite you to use that language, even though I know California, we still use that term. And so I'm also a former bilingual elementary and middle school math and science teacher. I used to teach in a dual language program, so I taught math and science in English and in Spanish. And my PhD in education focused on teaching. And so I specifically focus on preparing critically conscious educators to focus on early STEM education. So the students in my courses and my science methods courses are all around education. And moving into some statistics that I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. This is a representation of racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. by degree attainment. So focusing on the second row here, we have from associate degree to all the way down to doctoral degrees. And because my presentation is focused on Latinx students, I'm looking at the red bars right here, which represent Hispanic or Latinx students. So we can see these diversity discrepancies. And so there's disparities in STEM attainment, and these are some of the challenges that our students face. And when we think about the pipeline, if we look at the demographics just last academic year about K-12 students and those that are Hispanic, more than half of our students right now in California in K-12 are Hispanic Latinx backgrounds. And so what tends to happen is that there's these deficit perspectives and ideologies since kindergarten, and there's studies that have been done about this. And this, I have some information here from a report from the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, and HACU is saying Hispanic teachers are only 8.8% of the teaching workforce, which is something to point out and something that we can look at, but it's not everything. And so the report goes on to mention that one of the things that we can do is to increase Hispanic STEM teachers in the whole nation. And they also point out that a lot of our students who come from these backgrounds, who are also low income students, these opportunities for internships that are unpaid, yes, it's great for your resume. Yes, it'll get you to know people, but some of us have to help out financially our families. And so this is something that's very inaccessible. And moving on to the last point here, the report's also saying, you know, we need to have adequate role models. And this is an important factor in supporting aspirations to STEM careers. So yes to all of this, but again, there's a little bit more that's what my focus for today will be on. And so we see here HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, from the 23 campuses that we have, 21 meet this campus criteria of Hispanic serving. And so the question that I raise is, how are we serving? And I know there's scholars out there like Gina Garcia, who's looking at Hispanic admitting and this idea of servitude. What are we doing once we admit the students? So to expand this idea, I talk about ideologies, which is why I said, you know, just hiring Hispanic looking teachers or professors, etc. It's a part of it, but it's not everything. And so it's our ideologies, right? Our sets of beliefs that help us understand this. And I'm citing here scholars who have worked specifically at San Diego State University and at Cal State San Marcos. And so we talk about ideological clarity as something that's used to rationalize an existing social order. And we talk about this diagram on the right side that we weigh and we balance, like, what is my ideology and what are the dominant ideologies? And as we think about STEM, you know, what ideologies are dominating in our STEM fields? And so in order for us to teach for equity and social justice, Cristina Alfaro and Dr. Ana Hernandez talk about announcing and denouncing teaching for equity and social justice. So I want to share about my approach to teaching. And so I acknowledge these are the dominant ideologies that are tend to be accepted as the truth, specifically in science. My examples for today are coming from my science methods course primarily. And so I pose the question of, how do I approach my work to challenge and disrupt hegemonic ideologies? And for this, I say, well, I tend to prescribe to asset-based theories. And on the right side, we see the work of Tara Yoso, who talks about community cultural wealth and the different types of capitals that our students bring into the classrooms, or that some of us as well, you know, we bring into our classrooms. And that I model asset-based pedagogy such as decolonizing science, anti-racist mathematics. And so I design my course in a way that allows for students to also challenge and disrupt these hegemonic ideologies. So I'm going to share 4 examples with you of what I do in my courses. And the first one is my syllabus. So how do you frame your course is a question that I'm posing to you. For me, these are on the first page of my syllabi, this is for teaching science to bilingual students on the left. And so because it's science, I have the next generation science standards, anti-racist science frameworks, critical abolitionist and decolonizing pedagogies. And so from day one, my students know this course will cover all these 3 areas, their intersectionalities as well. And I also taught math methods. So I have the math concept, the math practices, anti-racist mathematic frameworks, and culturally sustaining and relevant pedagogies, which we heard from our last 2 presenters. And so aside from framing my course in a specific way, I also have my reading assignments. What is it that my students are going to read in my class? Well, I include readings from scholars who come from BIPOC backgrounds. So, the question would be, how do you expose your students to that as well? And so not just is it that, well, you're going to read this article, but I also introduce the scholars. So for example, we're going to have Dr. Ximena sit in a second. I would have my students read Demographics of Physics and Science Education Research, which is something she published. And I would say, okay, you're going to read this article. And this is, Dr. Ximena Sid. She's a chair of physics at CSU Dominguez Hills. She identifies as Chicana and Yaqui, and she's only one of 6 indigenous PhD holders in the physics and astrophysics in the country. And so letting them know and doing the research of who you're about to read so that they know that there are people out there that are doing this work and that it is possible to continue this important work. The last thing I do in terms of my syllabus is that I ask students for feedback. And so I tell them from the beginning of the semester, and this is on my syllabi as well, I tell my students, every week I'm going to email 3 of you. I have 3 questions for you. What did I do well this week? What can I improve on? And anything else you want to tell me. And so by the end of the semester, I have 15 times 3 responses to just feedback, so I don't have to wait until the end to read my student evaluations. And yes, students know that I'm going to read them, and I tell them, and so they are comfortable sharing as much as they want to share with me. And on the first day of class, I have my students draw a scientist or a mathematician. And so for this particular example, I have some illustrations of what my students have drawn. And because I check in with them about their illustrations, I can tell you that, all of these students tend to, and I have about 6 years worth of these drawings. Math scientists, we see lab coats. We see people working in labs. We see the gender male, and again, this was confirmed with them, and working in isolation, and then these goggles. So this is, I know, an activity that my students, but it's also been done with children and just students in all different ages. And you might say, well, why is it that they would draw this? Well, when we go on social media, when we go and see our textbooks and we Google famous scientists, these are the ideologies or, the messages that we're sending our students. And so we have to be intentional about the way that we teach because we've been fed these messages most of our lives. And so this is a physics textbook that I use as an 8th grade teacher, and I did a picture walk. And so a picture walk, you just scroll through the textbook and you look at the pictures, you look at the graphs. And so I did one specifically to look at gender representation, and I can tell you that there were 13 male scientists represented in the textbook, while there were 6 female representations. So I say 6 female, not 6 female scientists. There were only 2 female scientists. And the other images of women in the textbook were the following. There's a woman pushing a box in an example, and then another woman painting a plate for the chemistry of art section. The last example I have for my class is this 2-part assignment. So the first day of class or the first week of class, I have them write a letter to their former science teacher, where I have them reflect on their experiences of what was science for you growing up. Did you see yourself in science? How were you taught science? Did you enjoy science? And so the second part of the assignment then is at the end of the semester where I have them write a letter to their future selves. Because again, I'm preparing teachers, and this is for elementary methods. And so I have them, well, I'll go into that a little bit more, but I do have the assignment and I create a rubric. And what this does is it's also helping our students with their writing skills, because I'm also teaching like what are the parts of a letter, how do you write a letter, and if we think back on our grad students or just our students in general, when they need letters of recommendation, I know this was my experience that I would request a letter and I was told, well, why don't you write the letter? But it's like, well, I don't even know how to write this type of letter. So there are things that we can do in our classes now that are setting up our students for success. So this is an example of a letter that one of my students submitted this semester. And so the student talks about, I remember that the majority of the time I couldn't connect with the subject due to the terminology. I didn't have a spark of curiosity. And then she goes on to talk about how she had to learn from Bill Bill Nye the Science Guy. And then the closure letter is APA citations. I have them summarize 3 strategies that they learned in class. And so not only is this a letter to their future selves, and I have them submitted at the end of the semester, but also they get to, I mail it back to them. And so there's a lot of recommendations, and I return to this policy paper, or this proceeding. And so Haku talks about increasing funding and stronger laboratory STEM. So these are all great ideas, and I do agree with them, but also we need to, again, remember the ideological clarity piece. So in summary, Latinx students already come with ideologies about their persistence in STEM, and we have the ability to embrace all students in our learning spaces. We can be inclusive in how we design our courses and department programs, and it's okay to ask students, what do you need to be successful in my class? And so I leave you with these 2 questions. What are the ideologies that operate in your own classrooms? And have you thought about how to possibly decolonize your syllabus?
Thank you, Melissa, for a great talk. We have time for a question here. How do you find BIPOC authors to add to your syllabus readings?
So I tend to be part of various national organizations, international organizations, where I'm able to find colleagues that are doing this kind of work. One of these is AERA's Critical Educators for Social Justice Special Interest Group. Another one would be SACNAS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. There's a Creating Balance conference, which focuses on math and education and social justice. You saw a bunch of examples today in all of our presenters and what they've shared, and contacting other colleagues and other institutions. And I guess the last thing I could say is to prepare our students to become the next generation of BIPOC researchers.
Thank you, Melissa, for a great presentation, and certainly for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Cathrine Maiorca, or Cat, as she's also known by, from Cal State Long Beach. Her presentation is entitled Using an Equity-Oriented Framework to Teach STEM. Kat, your turn.
All right, thank you. I'm really excited to be presenting today, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some work that I'm doing with a larger research group. So I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. The collaborators that I'm working with who worked on this paper with me are Krista Johnson, who is at Iowa State, and she's the lead author, and then Margaret Morschroeder, who's from the University of Kentucky, Sarah Bush from the University of Central Florida, and then myself, and then Thomas Roberts, who's at Bowling Green State University, and then 2 students, which is a fantastic way that they work, is Caitlin Yost and Abigail Fowler. So today I want to talk about using integrated STEM to help our students. Sorry. And so integrated STEM, which, makes STEM subjects more meaningful. And so when I say integrated STEM, I'm talking about integrating 2 or more of the STEM areas that in a problem that addresses real world problems that students would be interested in. So it increases students' engagement. It also has been shown to increase, to raise students' achievements in the content classes. So given the importance of integrated STEM, it's imperative that each and every student have access to integrated STEM learning experiences, especially those that are minoritized in STEM. And the framework that I'm going to be presenting today is designed to disrupt the system of oppression that are evident in our society and provide each and every student, including minoritized students, the opportunity and access to engage in high-quality STEM experiences, which will develop their STEM literacy, which is a critical asset needed in today's world. And so why are we focusing on STEM literacy? because STEM literacy is the integration of the STEM disciplines and the tools and knowledge necessary to apply STEM concepts to solve complex problems. In students, this promotes and fosters innovative thinking, collaboration, creativity, problem solving, and critical thinking and communication skills. The specific components addressed in this framework are dispositions, STEM identity, development, empowerment, critical thinking, problem solving, utility and application, and empathy. And we can't really address any of these elements without first providing opportunity and access to integrated STEM. So the conceptual framework is off to the side, and it begins with providing students, the quality of the STEM learning experience, which they're going to engage in matters. So that's the top. And each and every student deserves access to the highest quality integrated STEM learning experiences, where students apply the content and practices of disciplines to solve authentic problems in rigorous ways. So access to engaging in authentic learning experiences promotes STEM literacy among students. And we have found that inquiry approaches, which include hands-on activities and purposeful discourse strategies that elicit and honor students' thinking, provide opportunities for meaning making and encouraging and sense of belonging in STEM. So utility and applicability addresses how worthwhile students see STEM. It's the extent that students recognize STEM as it relates to the world and the skill associated with STEM areas that are useful to address real world problems. So STEM learning environments provide rich experiences in which students have the opportunity to apply their critical thinking skills to solve complex problems. And if you think about it further, students get to visualize and see the applicability and utility of the solutions to their complex problems in the world around them. So how can it help their community? How can it help society? And when students are able to see these experiences and see how they would apply to their personal lives, it helps interest them in integrated STEM. Okay. Sorry. So one of the things that we found through our research is that developing empathy in students for an inquiry activity has a lot of potential to bridge students who have encountered real or perceived barriers that they've seen for STEM. So positioning empathy as a key access point to STEM potentially makes learning experiences more meaningful and helps them identify the impact in both their lives and the lives of others. And so in another study, we found that empathy has a potential also to make students interested in STEM careers. So like some examples that we found, that we had students who wanted to build robots so they could rescue people who had been in a building that was collapsed from earthquakes. And then we also had another student who wanted to be able to build prosthetic legs for their dog. And an activity that we did that focused on empathy was exploring how tiny homes could be a solution for homelessness. And so while students are engaging in these activities, we want students to develop a productive STEM discipline, which we're calling the attitude, interest in, and motivation in STEM. And so in addition to building these STEM dispositions, they're also building knowledge and interest in various STEM careers. So studies have shown in math and science and in STEM that positive attitudes towards a specific content area is a key factor in increasing achievement in that content area. So a quality STEM learning experience should promote positive dispositions and attitudes towards STEM and are important in helping support student achievement in those areas. And so you'll notice that the framework is circular. So students are developing, their disposition and empathy and seeing the utility applicability all the time. So it's constantly occurring. And one of the things that's really important as they're developing their dispositions is that they have to see themselves as belonging in STEM. And unfortunately, several barriers exist to forming positive STEM identities, and minoritized students are less likely to see themselves as a scientist, a mathematician, and then they don't feel like they belong in the STEM community. So our framework it demands learning experiences which will affirm and encourage students' identities, because they are critical in promoting positive STEM identities, particularly for minoritized students, but also for all students. So with mathematics being the foundation of STEM, the students' early experiences are critical for building positive mathematical identities. And if they don't have these identities, it typically, like, mathematics is the gatekeeper for more advanced STEM study. So a high quality integrated STEM learning experience is central to the framework to help students see how you can apply STEM in a subject matter area. And as students see the use and applicability of STEM in the world around them, they'll develop a more positive STEM identity. And as students are working through this framework, then hopefully, like, we want them to be empowered. And so researchers have found that instruction students receive and the educational experiences in either a formal or informal learning experience empower students to positively influence their long-term persistence. So studies highlight the characteristics of STEM learning environments that have been shown to positively empower minoritized students in STEM. And one of the things that we found is that students say that they enjoy the social aspect of STEM that they participated in. The social interactions made the experience more enjoyable. They increased their interest and motivation and helped create a community in which everyone supported the learning and success of others. So culturally relevant pedagogy can show students that STEM can be part of their everyday lives and not something that's challenging or atypical in like a Black or Latinx communities. And so one of the things we've also found that's very important for students to see empowerment is that they need to have mentors and exposure to STEM professionals who can help empower them. So they need to be able to see a STEM professional and say, okay, I look like him, or her, I can be an engineer. And these mentors and STEM professionals are huge role models that will help orientate students towards college and taking STEM, pursuing STEM careers. So lastly, as we're looking at this, as students are going through the framework, we want them to be able to become societal change agents. So, as students develop and become more STEM literate, they're developing agency, which positions them to change as a change agent in society where they live. So using this framework and attending to each and every one of the components and giving the students the needed space to see that STEM is a tool and is critical to critique and understand the society around them. And in doing so, students' perception of their capacity to act as societal change agents using knowledge, skills, and dispositions associated with the STEM areas. And so as societal change agents, students continue to work towards achieving personal goals and drawing on all the components discussed in our framework, and look at solving real-world issues and challenges in the community at the broader level, which is disrupting the system of oppression. And so one of the ways that this can be applied in a various ways that we'd like to see it being applied is that the equity-oriented STEM literacy conceptual framework can be used as a guide for developing rich activities in integrated STEM learning experiences for each and every student. So, such as we've described earlier. So when developing a STEM experience, whether either in a formal or an informal STEM learning environment, we need to ensure that each one of the components of the framework is honored and attended to in planning and executing the STEM learning experiences. And while if we do this, then we will disrupt the systems of oppression and privilege, but leaving out one component of the framework will risk disadvantaging minoritized populations. So I forgot to change the slide, so that's my last slide.
Thank you, Kat. And thanks for a great presentation, and certainly for really summarizing a lot of the, a lot of things we've been hearing about and chatting about for a number of years. Question here. Why is it important to teach STEM using an equity focus?
Okay. Well, so there's like a twofold answer, like as a practitioner and then as a researcher that we're looking at it. As a practitioner, like we need to create authentic hands-on experiences that engage our students, and that's looking at our students' community and what problems that they're interested in solving and basing it very student-centered. And then creating these activities so that students can see themselves as creators and doers of STEM. So for a research perspective, we need to position equity as a non-negotiable, because if we don't, then we're going to continue to perpetuate that system of oppression and privilege, and further disadvantage our minoritized populations.
For really tying things together, I think it's a really wonderful presentation, and really like your slides. So really, thank you for presenting today.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rouhollah Aghasaleh, and hopefully I said that correctly, from Humboldt State, way up north. His talk is entitled "Another STEM Teaching is Possible Toward a Phronetic Scientific Knowledge." Rouhollah, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Frank, Jennifer, Monica, and all those who made this happen. My name is Rouhollah Aghasaleh from School of Education at Humboldt State University from the beautiful Arcata. We begin by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Viet peoples, which include the Viet tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Arcata is known as Gudini, meaning over the woods or among the redwoods. Viet people continue to remain in relationship to those lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. They are important parts of not only the history of this area, but also in continuing knowledges of this place. Several colleagues today are discussing different approaches to what I call justice-oriented pedagogy that are well implemented and well conceptualized in educational theory and practice. First, informed by Marxist and critical theory of post-World War era, Paulo Freire wrote his famous Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1968 and translated into English in 1970, where he introduced concepts such as oppression, banking concept of education, praxis, and conscientization. Later, multicultural education was conceptualized by scholars such as Banks and Banks in 1989 and Sonia Nieto in 1992. They focus on content integration, multicultural education as basic pedagogy as a process, and also multicultural education for all. As discussed by Aletha, culturally relevant pedagogy, coined by Gloria Ladson-Billing as a pedagogy that empowers the students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural and historical reference to convey knowledge, to impart skills, and to change attitudes. So she used this idea of teachers as dream keepers. Culturally responsive pedagogy as the use of cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance style of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for students and community was introduced by Geneva Gay in 2000. More recently are culturally and linguistically responsive that validates and affirms and builds bridges and culturally sustaining pedagogy introduced by Paris and Sami Alim in 2014. They focus on cultural pluralism, humanity, identity, history, language, families, and community. Although the idea of intersectionality was introduced in 1980s by Kimberly Crenshaw, a feminist scholar, the American iterations of justice-oriented pedagogies are still focused on the issue of race, which is very important. Some of these scholars in their later versions of these orientations, like Nieto in 2012 and Latson-Billing in 2014, and Kumashiro in his anti-oppressive, they are more intersectional, but still race remains the main focus for these justice-oriented pedagogies. Today I'm going to take another angle and to look at these justice-oriented pedagogy by talking about paradigms. None of the above-mentioned scholars were interested in methodology. Ontology is about being. What is the nature of reality? Of course, our language is a reflection of ontology. Some of the ontologies that we know are idealism, realism, constructivism, and humanism, which is very dominant in our science world. Then we need to think about epistemology, which is about knowledge. What is the relationship between the knower and the noun? Again, this language suggests a separation and binary opposition between the subject and object. So we are not out of our language boundaries when we conceptualize all these things. Some of the epistemology approaches that we know are feminist standpoint epistemology, critical theory, and empiricism, which is also the dominant. And then methodology. We all take methodology courses. That is about research, is about inquiry. That's about how should the knowledge be found or generated. Some examples are interpretivism, phenomenology, emancipatory research, deconstruction, and scientific-based research, which is again the dominant. So I would like to discuss about ontological turn. So I argue that all those justice-oriented approaches are not sufficient if we do not think about this ontological turn and we do not think about the nature of science. And I argue that Phronetic science is what we need. The recent history of the planet has thrown up multiple reminders that modernist dualist logic has outlived its usefulness in making sense of life in the 21st century. This has made it increasingly difficult to ignore the presence of entities around us that resist being categorized under any dualist ontology. For example, COVID-19 and environmental crisis, among others, have been identified as dualism-busting assemblages of the capitalist scene and present wicked problems for humanity. What we need is science learning approach, a science learning approach that acknowledges a societal standpoint to address the wicked problems of Capitalocene and Anthropocene, which means the humanist hegemony, the idea that human sovereign and controls and rules the planet and the world, which has been so harmful. Knowing how human activities have impacted nature and that environmental changes is influencing human life, some international agencies have called for research on how different societies responded to environmental change. Some other wicked problem that the Enlightenment, Western modern science, which is what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, is not sufficient to address. Again, some examples are this nature culture problem that we have been living through for the past year or so. Global racism, xenophobia, heterosexism, wealth inequality. Let's not forget that modern science has justified and fueled eugenics, genocides, colonialism, homophobia, and what we call biology. Ontological turn is an end to incrementalism idea, the idea that knowledge steadily accumulates as an epistemological feature. The accumulation of knowledge in science meant one bit of knowledge builds on another and then another, correcting errors along the way until there is a solid body of scientific truth. Kuhn's work showed that what we claim to be scientific truth is in one paradigm at one historical moment will no longer be true after a paradigm shift. Therefore, the normal science in each discipline and each paradigm is insufficient to address these wicked problems. So we call for new ethico-onto-epistemologies, which is post-Enlightenment, non-Western, non-modern science. So these are some examples. Phronetic science is practical wisdom that manifests itself in the kind of prudential judgment by which equivocal circumstances are negotiated and acted upon with a view for the common good. In other words, a morally guided and praxis-oriented form of knowledge. Some examples are neo-materialism, neo-feminism, agential realism, post-humanism, slow science, flattened ontology, which are at the intersection of feminisms and post-structural philosophies. So how do these neo-ontologies and these phronetic scientific knowledge support and help students and communities, especially the minoritized? These ontologies disrupt the deficit-based approach and send a message to communities that their home culture and indigenous way of problem solving are valued and recognizable as science, as a response to an old but still relevant question by feminist scholars: whose science, whose knowledge? So how does science benefit from new ontologies? Given that wicked problems are marked by value-laden moral predicaments that are imperious to both episteme and techne, it is clear that if we are to survive the Capitalocene, we need to collectively position phronesis as a primary end goal of science. And finally, as a summary, I would say it is crucial for science educators to address issues of equity, representation, identity, and justice beyond instructional methods and consider ethico-onto-epistemologies which are informed by critical, feminist, indigenous, interpretive, linguistic, cultural, legitimation crisis, ethical, slow science, agential realist, post-structural, post-colonial, decolonial, post-humanist, anti-oppressive, standpoint epistemology, neo-materialist, race and ethnic terms and theories in science studies as alternative ways to conceptualize research and teaching in science, technology, engineering, and math. Thank you.
Thank you, Rouhollah. Question, certainly a wonderful presentation. How does science benefit from new ontologies?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. That's a very important question. So when we invite this justice-oriented and this new approach to think about science and the nature of science, this is not only minoritized people who benefit from being included. But also science itself benefits from this transition. So this ontological turn is about a paradigm shift. So if the science is going to help us to survive this Capitalocene and this Anthropocene era, we need this Phronetic science. The current science, the current modern Enlightenment and Western science is insufficient for these wicked problems that we currently have. So this Phronetic scientific knowledge, which is multiple, not universal, based on radical openness, which is situated, which is not hierarchical, which is socioculturally relevant, which is not humanist, and it is ethical. I think this is what we need, and this is what science needs.
Thank you, Rouhollah, and thank you for presenting today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, and certainly last but not least, is Ximena Sid from Cal State Dominguez Hills. Her presentation is entitled The Demographics of PER and How Our Knowledge is Impacted by Who We Do and Do Not Study. Ximena, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. We've had a pretty amazing talks so far. My audio, some of you also mentioned that your audio is cutting in and out. My audio is also cutting in and out a little bit. So I wanted to share the paper that I'm primarily going to be talking about, and which was also mentioned by one of our earlier speakers, Melissa Navarro. So as mentioned, I'm Dr. Ximena Sid. I'm associate professor and the chair of the physics department at California State University, Dominguez Hills. I want to acknowledge that our campus sits on the traditional lands of the Tongva people. So I give thanks for the continued protection and care that the Tongva people provide for our space. I also want to acknowledge that there's an ongoing conflict between the Tongva people and one of our sister campuses, Cal State Long Beach, for one of their traditional sacred sites, Pavungla. And so that's actively going on within our CSU system. And so we do need to acknowledge and address sometimes the spaces that we occupy and how that impacts our traditional peoples. I also identify as Chicana and Yaqui, so when it comes to indigenous issues, they're very close to my heart. So today I'm going to be talking to everyone about the demographics of PER and how our knowledge is impacted by who we do and do not study. It's a little bit of a shift between the talks that we had earlier, but it gives context into how we actually view success and best practices within STEM fields and STEM education fields, whether that's K-12 or higher education. And so just to frame us, who I'm talking about, I have some numbers here in terms of who actually studies physics within the U.S. So we have 1,376,000 high school students, two-year colleges, 215,000, four-year institutions, 450,000, and then graduate institutions, almost 16,000. So the goal of this study, why do we actually do this study, is as a Chicana, as a woman, as an indigenous person, when I would sit in our talks or have these national conversations about what it means to be successful within physics or who is going to benefit from the curriculum that we develop, I was also always questioning, where do I fit into these narratives? I come from a very urban background, a very underfunded K-12 education, public education. The school that I came out of from high school didn't even have lockers or textbooks. So when I went to Berkeley for undergrad in astrophysics, I was very out of my league. And so when I think about how is it that we actually prepare our students, now that I'm on the other side of that, I question what is it that we mean when we define our measures of success. I did this work with a colleague of mine, Dr. Steve Canham. He's emeritus faculty at New Mexico State University. And so both of us, I think, kind of came into these questions about how, who do we study and how does that impact our ideas from very different areas. I came out of it from a very personal perspective and thinking about where do I fit personally, where do my peers fit, people like me, other Black, Indigenous, people of color, where do we fit within this narrative? And Steve was coming at it from someone who had actually developed a lot of this curriculum, and then when he transferred institutions, started recognizing that there were huge discrepancies between what the published literature was defining, as benchmarks or baselines, and the students that he was serving out in New Mexico. So we got together and we started to really look at what is our field think and who do we actually study. And so we did this work where we analyzed all of the papers that were published from 3 of our prominent journals, the American Journal of Physics, Physics Review, Physics Education and Research, and the Physics Teacher. And so we looked between 1970 and 2015, and we analyzed all of those papers. There's a bunch of information in the paper that I'm not going to go into today, so I posted that in the chat. But the things that I really want to kind of focus on today are 2-year colleges and calculus-based courses. So when we look at the total number of students that we studied from all of those 3 journals between 1970 and 2015, there's out of 257,000, there were only about 701 students from 2-year colleges. And yet when we look at the calculus-based courses, there's 179,000. So there's a huge discrepancy between who we actually study and what that content level is about. I really like this image in the sense that it's really showing the discrepancies between who actually we study and who do we actually teach. And so even within our field, 26% of students are taking physics at a community college, at a 2-year college, and yet we're only studying 0.4%. And when we look at the calculus-based courses, 83% of our data, 83% of our sample populations that are defining our ideas about best practices, expert-like thinking, conceptual framework, curriculum development, they're all based within the calculus-based courses, whereas we're only teaching about 34% of them in terms of the numbers that we studied or we looked at. We know that 2-year colleges are by far the most diverse in every aspect. Within the CSU, we have similar numbers, right? We're primarily serving underrepresented students, low-income students, first-generation students. So we have similar populations, right? And that's kind of understandable in the sense that we're also using 2-year colleges as our feeder campuses, right? But yet we're not studying them. We don't know hardly anything about that content knowledge. So there's a very big problem with that. Some of the things that we identified within our studies, we looked at math preparation, and we defined that by the SAT math. Again, our paper goes into a lot more of the limitations, a lot more of the statistics and how we analyze this stuff. But if we're looking at math preparation, we know that there's a bell curve, right, for the SAT. So all students, all high school students that are taking the SAT, but yet when we look at the populations that are being represented within PER samples, physics education research samples, it's very much is skewed to the right. And now when we were talking with our colleagues and we were sharing this data, initially some of our colleagues were like, wait a minute though, isn't it an assumption that we can make where physicists or students that are intending to be physicists would already start at a higher level math? And that's true, they do. But when we actually break that down and study, we took a small subset of maybe 3 institutions where we did look at who those students were that were being featured within the major. So 3 institutions that gave us the demographic breakdown of who was admitted. There's still a discrepancy between the overall admission rate as well as, those that are coming in. There is a little bit of a ceiling effect for institutions like some of our tech institutions that require all of their incoming freshman students to take physics as a requirement of their degrees. But for the most part, we really are seeing this skewed idea of what we mean to be mathematically prepared. And within the CSU system, we are actively talking about this, right? Most of us within our campuses are thinking about ways in which we are changing our incoming English and incoming math levels, right? And how we actually define those things. So we also looked at the ethnic breakdown, right? Ethnic and racial breakdown of the students within our 3 journals for those years that I already talked about. We're still seeing that it's primarily white. And when we also broke down like family incomes, parent incomes, most of our students were coming from affluent environments. So when we take these ideas as a whole, right, the things that we're walking away with, or the things that we are talking about as measures of success, are not defined for all of our students that we are trying to support. And how does this actually matter in the context of the conversations that we're having today, right? All of our speakers have talked about a sense of belonging, or what does it look like to even be a scientist? My colleague Melissa had mentioned studies where they're asking people to draw scientists, or the imagery that we receive from the media, right? And so even when we do Google searches, which is one of the slides that Melissa pulled up, we're often flooded with this imagery of white male scientists. And we see that play out in the conversations of how that actually defines our ideas of where we fit, people who are not traditionally represented within STEM fields. Where do we fit within our spaces? All of these ideas, right? All of this feedback that we have outside of our classrooms and within our classrooms start to create these ideas of bias or imposter syndrome. And so we start to then question, where do I fit? Should I be in this field? We don't talk enough either about what it means to fail. So students come in thinking that they have to be exceptional because all of the feedback that they're getting is usually defined as this exceptional ideology. And so when we're not meeting those standards, when we are doing self-evaluations as we're progressing through our STEM fields, there's so much information that is already implicitly telling us that we don't belong here. So in the context of STEM education, right, in the context of STEM education, which is what we're talking about today, physics education research, we are one of the primary fields to define what it means to be disciplinary education-based research, right, within our home STEM fields, right, within physics, within chemistry, within biology. We had to define the fact that education, or physics education, bioeducation, chem education, is a subfield of physics. And part of the way that we did that was to look at the gains, the comprehension gains within our courses. And so we did have to start somewhere, right, to get the buy-in from our colleagues to really embrace the fact that looking at education, or looking at our fields from an educational lens, can tell us something, right? And to be fair, if I wanted to understand why a student is having issues with quantum mechanics, I should be fluent in quantum mechanics to begin with. It's very difficult to answer those types of questions if you don't have that competency to begin with. So if we're looking at, the measures that we are defining as success, or the curriculum that we're defining, if all we're doing is sampling students that are already well-prepared mathematically, white, male, affluent, all of those ideas, right? All of those categories that are already in the majority, then we're already doing a disservice to our students and to people like me. And so I get really offended by that. And I have been offended throughout my career, which is why I started doing this work to begin with, to really do an assessment and do an analysis in the language of our field so that we can actually have these national conversations to change those perceptions. And so I think that it's really important to always ask yourself, when you're trying to make a change, or when you're trying to incorporate new curriculum, to first take a step back and ask, who is this curriculum defined for? And if it wasn't defined for the students that you're serving, how are you going to assess the baselines with respect to what you're supposed to see in terms of conceptual gains? So that's one thing that I tend to ask my colleagues is how are you measuring your baseline? And if you're just looking at a comparison to our students are already not within that national standard. And so we have to be very careful on how we describe that so we actually can support the students with the curriculum that we're going to use or the frameworks that we're going to be using. So that's really what we talk about within my paper. I encourage all of you to check it out. There's a lot more details within it. And I see Frank, so it looks like my time is up.
Thank you, Ximena, for certainly a very, very interesting study and analysis. It's really great to see the correlation and relationship between the two-year community colleges and the Cal States. Very briefly, one quick question. Faculty in the STEM field often tell those of us who lead professional development on CRT that there's no culture in science and math and no time to spend on CRT because they have so much more they need to cover in their classes. How can we help them see otherwise?
Okay, so just to reframe, with Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas, critical race theory is the view that the law and legal institutions and academic institutions are inherently racist and that race itself is a social construct. And that it was created so that white people can further their economic and political interests at the expense of people of color, right? So we have to remember that when we're thinking about education, and when we're thinking about STEM education and STEM history, history is written by the conquerors or the colonizers. And so it's a lie when we think about, STEM fields as having no culture. We clearly have a culture. People like to have this idea that we are fact-based, right? But we are still human beings doing science. And so our own biases and our own racism or sexism or whatever ism that people have is going to come out. And we see that within computer science, algorithms, self-driving cars. We see all of these biases that happen, especially towards indigenous folks, Black folks, people of color. And so when people try to say that we don't have a culture within STEM, number one, you're lazy, right? So there is enough evidence now. And the internet is accessible, Wikipedia is accessible, all of these free resources are accessible. So if you're not doing your own work, it is you who's being lazy and doing a disservice to your students. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that the system is designed to continue to support a certain population. And if you are advantaged by that and you are successful by that, you are the person that this system is designed for. And so if we are not taking a step back to acknowledge our own advantages, all of us as professors have our own advantages. We have successfully gone through this academic system, right? So even if we are coming from a disadvantaged background or minoritized background, we still have advanced ourselves to a certain point. So it's our job as faculty, it's our job as researchers to also acknowledge the privileges and the benefits that we have and to do our own work to make sure that the spaces that we occupy are equitable and just for everybody and inclusive for everybody, right? So when people say that there's no culture within STEM fields, it's a lie. We've systematically erased a lot of the history from cultures outside of Western European ideologies to develop our fields to begin with.
Great, thank you, Ximena. And thank you to everybody who has presented today. It's certainly been very insightful and certainly a lot of food for thought for everybody within the CSU.
I'd like to also really quick before we end, I posted not only the link for my paper, but I posted 2 other links. People were asking for resources. Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein is a very outspoken Black physicist, Black cosmologist. She's created a Decolonizing STEM reading list, and I posted that in there. I also posted some materials from colleagues of mine within physics education that incorporate critical race theory or aspects of justice, inclusion, diversity, and equity within K-12 education curriculum as well as within higher ed. So it's really thinking about what is it we value in terms of how we change and structure our courses. So that's some curriculum that you can look at that's already developed as well.
Great, thanks. To everyone, speaker contact information is provided here. For more information on the presentations, please contact the speakers, as this could lead to a collaboration or proposal opportunity in the future. In addition, a link to the webcast will soon be made available on the STEMnet website. For more information on this webcast, please contact Monica Alarcon or myself, and previous webcasts can be found there, and this website will be posted probably in a week or so. STEMnet is always looking to collaborate and write multi-campus proposals with faculty, and in fact have submitted approximately 8 proposals since October, partnering with the 11 CSU institutions. So if you have an idea and would like to meet to discuss your project, do not hesitate to reach out to me at fgomez@calstate.edu. And finally, Saturday will mark the 1-year anniversary of the day all of our lives abruptly changed. We all knew something was on the horizon. Faculty had been told to prepare for the possibility of class cancellations and the need to teach from home. Like a storm, COVID-19 slowly gripped every corner of the globe and touched every aspect of our lives. But unlike a storm where we typically can forecast its strength and duration, we neither knew its power nor eventual toll it would take over the coming year. The pandemic has impacted all aspects of society. We all had a sense things were going to look different, but no one had an idea just how much our lives would be impacted. What we should realize now more than ever is how connected we are to each other, to nature, and to planet Earth. It follows, how can we work together during this unprecedented of times to make substantive change throughout the world? The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet, now and into the future. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which are an urgent call for action by all countries in a global partnership. They recognize that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. If you think this sounds similar to the mission of the CSU, you are not alone. Today's webcast, speakers, and registrants are prime examples of how we are participating in this global partnership, namely quality education, gender equality, reduced inequalities, good health and well-being, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. As the world awakens more and more each day from its hiatus, let us remember to not forget what we have learned these past 12 months. Look at it as an opportunity, a gift, to make us better. To all of you, be safe. May the rest of your day be a happy one. I now turn it over to our excellent executive producer, who keeps me sound and sane, Jennifer Wicks, for a few closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Frank. No pressure, sound and sane. Thank you so much for your closing remarks and bringing this incredible group of presenters together from across our CSU system. What an amazing session today. So we want to thank each of you very much, and also want to just share a few announcements. As we do have a survey available, would love for your feedback, prepared by Monica Alarcon behind the scenes. Also, if you could join our CSU STEMnet community listserv over on the left side, you'll see access to that link there. And to begin a conversation with colleagues and join our private CSU STEMnet Facebook group, there's also a link there as well. Love for you to join us. And coming up, the Virtual Research Cafe 10.0 is on March 19th. As you can see on the screen, you can also register at that link there on the left side. And then the STEMnet April webcast on April 15th. We look forward to seeing you then. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap. Wish you a wonderful rest of the day and see you very soon next month. Thanks, everybody.